Sometimes, the greatest inheritance isn't gold or land, it's the weight of unfinished business. Every family carries secrets, but some secrets can change the fate of entire kingdoms. When 23-year-old Solveig claimed her family's abandoned fortress, she expected empty rooms and old memories. Instead, she found a hidden chamber filled with ancient weapons covered in runes that made the village elders go pale. These weren't ordinary swords and shields. They were tools of war, carefully stored for a battle her ancestors never fought. The weapons hummed with strange energy, and some bore dark stains that wouldn't wash clean. Now the village demands she hand them over, while others whisper she was meant to find them. But what war were her people preparing for, and why did these cursed weapons wait centuries for her? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the fjord like the breath of sleeping gods, and Solveig Eriksdottir stood at the edge of her world, watching the sun paint the water gold. At 23, she had learned that patience was a weapon sharper than any blade. The village of Ravenshollow stretched behind her, its wooden houses and stone foundations built by hands that understood both beauty and survival. Smoke rose from morning fires, carrying the scent of pine and barley bread that had comforted her since childhood. Her father's bloodline medallion pressed warm against her chest beneath her wool tunic, a simple bronze disc etched with ravens and knots that marked her as Eriksdottir, daughter of the line that once ruled the abandoned fortress on Ironspear Ridge. The medallion had been her father's final gift, pressed into her palm with words that still echoed in quiet moments. "When the time comes, little raven, you'll know what to do." That time had come 3 days ago. The present village council had finally grown weary of debating the ownership of Ironspear Fortress. For 15 years, the ancient stronghold had stood empty on its rocky perch above the valley, its walls weathered but unbroken, its towers reaching toward clouds that seemed perpetually grey. Various claimants had argued their cases: distant cousins with questionable genealogies, ambitious merchants with more gold than honor, even a few jarls from neighboring settlements who saw opportunity in the legal vacuum. But Solveig had waited. While others shouted their claims in the council hall, she had spent those years learning. Her mentor, old Magnus, had taught her to read not just runes but people, to understand the difference between what was said and what was meant. Her father's sister, Astrid, had shared stories of their bloodline that weren't written in any saga, tales of women who had held Ironspear when the men were away raiding, of strategic minds that had kept the fortress unconquered for 3 generations. "Strategy wins what strength cannot," her father had often said, and Solveig had taken those words to heart. The council meeting had been a masterpiece of patience and preparation. While her rivals had blustered and threatened, Solveig had simply presented her case with quiet confidence. The bloodline medallion, verified by 3 separate rune masters, her father's documented lineage, traced through the settlement's own records, the sworn testimony of elders who remembered when Eriksdottir had been a name that carried weight in these valleys. Most importantly, she had offered something her competitors could not, a genuine connection to Ravenshollow itself. While they spoke of profit and expansion, she had talked about preservation and protection. The fortress wasn't just a prize to be claimed, it was a responsibility to be shouldered. Elder Bjorn Whitehair, the council's most respected member, had nodded slowly as she spoke, his grey eyes sharp despite his 70 winters had studied her with the intensity of a man who had seen kingdoms rise and fall. "The blood runs true," he had said finally, and those 4 words had carried more weight than all her rivals' arguments combined. Now, 3 days later, Solveig prepared for the journey that would change everything. Her closest friend, Ingrid Haraldsdottir, approached across the dewy grass, her red hair braided with the blue ribbon that marked her as the settlement's most skilled healer. They had grown up together, shared secrets and sorrows, celebrated each other's victories, and mourned each other's losses. If anyone understood the weight of this moment, it was Ingrid. "The whole village is talking," Ingrid said, settling beside Solveig on the flat stone that served as their traditional thinking place. "Some say you're brave, others say you're foolish. And what do you say?" Ingrid smiled, the expression that had charmed half the young men in Ravenshollow and intimidated the other half. "I say you're both, which is why you'll either succeed brilliantly or fail spectacularly. Either way, it won't be boring." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the village wake up around them. Fishermen prepared their boats for the day's work, their weathered hands checking nets and lines with practiced efficiency. Children chased chickens between the houses, their laughter bright as silver bells. Mothers hung washing on lines that stretched between buildings like prayer flags, their movements efficient and purposeful. This was the world Solveig had always known. Small, predictable, safe. The fortress represented something else entirely: legacy, responsibility, and perhaps most frighteningly, solitude. "Magnus wants to see you before you leave," Ingrid said, breaking the contemplative quiet. "He's been muttering about family histories and ancient warnings. You know how he gets when he's worried." Solveig did know. Magnus Ironbeard had been her father's closest friend and her unofficial guardian since Eric's death 5 years ago. The old warrior had fought in more battles than most men could count, but he reserved his deepest concern for the conflicts that couldn't be won with sword and shield. "He thinks I'm making a mistake. He thinks you're walking into something you don't understand. There's a difference." That difference felt vast as an ocean as Solveig made her way through the village toward Magnus's workshop. The old warrior lived in a house that reflected his nature, solid, functional, and filled with the tools of his various trades. Weapons hung from the rafters alongside carpentry tools, fishing nets, and the leather working equipment that supplemented his income during peaceful seasons. Magnus stood at his forge, his massive frame silhouetted against the red glow of burning coals. Even at 65, he moved with the controlled power of a man who had never forgotten that survival depended on strength, skill, and constant vigilance. His iron-grey beard, the source of his nickname, was braided with small silver rings that chimed softly when he moved. "Solveig," he said without turning around, "come to say goodbye to an old fool. Come to listen to whatever wisdom that old fool wants to share." He smiled at that, setting down his hammer and turning to face her. The years had etched deep lines around his blue eyes, but they remained as sharp as the blades he forged. "Your father would be proud of how you handled the council. Eric's daughter always had a gift for making strength look like gentleness. But Iron Spear Fortress has been empty for good reason. Your grandfather didn't abandon it because of political pressure or economic hardship. He left because something in those walls made even brave men wake screaming from nightmares." This wasn't the first time Magnus had hinted at dark stories surrounding the fortress, but he had never been specific. Solveig had assumed the tales were typical of abandoned places, shadows that looked like figures, sounds that had no source, the kind of stories that grew larger with each telling. What kind of something? Magnus was quiet for a long moment, his gaze distant as if seeing into memories he would rather leave buried. "Your grandfather spoke of voices in the walls, objects that moved without explanation, dreams that felt more real than waking. Most disturbing of all, a sense that the fortress was waiting for something. Waiting for what? That's what he never determined, but he believed it was connected to the old bloodline, to your family specifically. He thought leaving would break whatever connection existed. Perhaps he was wrong. The implications settled over Solveig like a cold mist. If Magnus was right, her successful claim to the fortress might not be the victory she had assumed. It might be the completion of something her grandfather had tried to prevent. "Are you telling me not to go?" Magnus studied her for a long moment, weighing words like a merchant weighing silver. "I'm telling you to be careful. Take supplies for a long stay. The fortress is 2 days hard riding from here, and you'll want to establish yourself properly before winter sets in." Take weapons, even though you prefer peace to conflict. Most importantly, take this." He reached beneath his workbench and withdrew a small leather pouch, its surface worn smooth by countless hands. "Your grandfather left this with me before he abandoned Ironspear. He said if anyone from the bloodline ever returned to claim the fortress, they should have it." Solveig accepted the pouch with trembling fingers. The leather was old, but well-maintained, and something inside shifted with a sound like metal against metal. "What is it?" "I don't know. He made me promise never to open it. Said it would only be meaningful to someone who belonged there." The weight of the pouch seemed disproportionate to its size, as if it contained more than mere objects. Solveig tucked it into her belt pouch, next to the bloodline medallion that had already proven its worth. As she prepared to leave Magnus's workshop, the old warrior caught her arm gently. "One more thing, little raven. If you find yourself in true danger, not the kind that can be solved with cleverness or courage, but the kind that threatens your very soul, remember that some battles are won by knowing when to retreat." The words followed her as she made her final preparations, gathering supplies and saying farewells to the people who had shaped her life. Her horse, a sturdy grey mare named Steinun, waited patiently as Solveig secured her travel packs and checked her equipment one final time. The entire village gathered to see her offer tribute that both honored and humbled her. These people had watched her grow from a grief-stricken daughter into a young woman of purpose and determination. Their faith in her felt like armor and burden combined. Elder Bjorn stepped forward as she mounted Steinun, his weathered face serious but not unkind. "The council's blessing goes with you, Solveig Eriksdottir. May you find what you seek in Ironspear's halls. And may what you find bring honor to our settlement," added Elder Ragnhild, the council's lone woman and its sharpest political mind. Solveig nodded to them both, then guided Steinun toward the mountain path that would take her to her destiny. The last thing she heard as the village fell behind was Ingrid's voice, calling across the morning air, "Send word when you're settled. We'll worry until we hear from you." The promise to send word felt like a lifeline as Solveig began the long journey to Ironspear Ridge. Behind her lay everything familiar and safe. Ahead waited the unknown, a fortress filled with family history, ancestral responsibility, and perhaps something far more dangerous than either. 2 days of steady riding brought Solveig to the base of Ironspear Ridge as the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the valley. The fortress loomed above her like a crown of stone, its walls built from the same grey granite as the mountain itself. From this distance, it looked almost alive, a sleeping giant that might wake at any moment to survey its domain. Steinun picked her way carefully up the winding path, her hooves finding purchase on stones worn smooth by generations of travelers. The higher they climbed, the more oppressive the silence became. No birds sang in these heights, no insects buzzed among the hardy mountain flowers. Even the wind seemed muted, as if the very air held its breath. The fortress gates stood open, their heavy oak doors sagging on iron hinges that had begun to rust during 15 years of abandonment. Solveig dismounted in the courtyard, her boots echoing strangely off the worn flagstones. The sound seemed to multiply and bounce off the surrounding walls, creating the illusion of invisible companions walking beside her. She tethered Steinun to an iron ring set into the wall, then stood in the center of the courtyard to truly absorb her inheritance. The main keep rose 4 stories above her, its windows dark as blind eyes. To her left, the armory and storage buildings showed signs of weather damage but remained structurally sound. To her right, a tower stretched toward the clouded sky, its upper levels disappearing into the mist that perpetually crowned the ridge. This was her birthright, stone and mortar, history and responsibility, all bound together by blood and law. It should have felt like triumph. Instead, it felt like stepping into a story whose ending had not yet been written. Solveig began her exploration methodically, starting with the ground floor of the main keep. The great hall stretched before her, dominated by a massive hearth that could warm an army. Trestle tables still stood where they had been left, their surfaces covered in dust, thick as velvet. Tapestries hung from the walls, their colors faded but their calm. Craftsmanship, still evident scenes of ravens in flight, ships on storm-tossed seas, warriors standing against impossible odds. She moved through the kitchens, the storage rooms, the smaller chambers that had once housed servants and guards. Everything spoke of a life interrupted rather than concluded. Plates remained on tables, clothes hung on pegs, beds were made, as if their occupants had simply stepped out for a moment and never returned. The second floor held the family quarters rooms that had belonged to her grandfather, her great-grandmother, ancestors whose names she knew from stories, but whose lives remained mysterious. In what had clearly been the Lord's chamber, she found a desk covered with documents in her grandfather's careful script. Most were routine records of grain harvests, tax collections, correspondence with neighboring lords, but one letter, left unfinished, caught her attention. "The dreams have grown stronger," her grandfather had written. "Each night I hear voices calling from below, not from the mountain, from beneath the fortress itself. Yesterday, young Harold swore he saw figures walking through walls in the lower levels. I begin to fear we are not alone in these halls." The letter ended abruptly, as if the writer had been interrupted. Solveig set it aside with trembling fingers, her grandfather's warnings echoing Magnus's concerns about the fortress's dark reputation. The third floor contained guest quarters and storage rooms, all similarly preserved in their abandoned state. But it was the fourth floor that made Solveig pause at the threshold. Unlike the other levels, this floor felt different, colder, despite being highest and closest to the afternoon sun. The air itself seemed thicker, charged with an energy that made her skin prickle. Only one room occupied this level, a circular chamber at the tower's heart. Ancient runes covered the walls from floor to ceiling, carved deep into the stone and filled with silver that caught the dim light filtering through narrow windows. The symbols meant nothing to Solveig, but they radiated age and purpose. In the chamber's center stood a simple stone table, its surface worn smooth by countless hands. Upon it rested a single object, an iron key longer than her palm, its head wrought in the shape of a raven with spread wings. This had to be the artifact Magnus had hinted at, something connected to her family's deepest secrets. As Solveig's fingers closed around the key, the world seemed to shift. For just a moment, the chamber filled with phantom voices, urgent whispers in the old tongue, words she couldn't understand, but that somehow conveyed desperate warning. The sensation lasted only seconds, but it left her gasping and disoriented. The key was warm in her palm, far warmer than iron should be, after sitting in a cold room for years. More disturbing still, it seemed to pulse gently, like a sleeping heart. Following instinct she couldn't name, Solveig began examining the chamber's walls more carefully. The runes weren't merely decorative, they formed patterns, sequences, something that might almost be instructions. Near the eastern wall, she discovered a section where the silver inlay formed the shape of a raven, identical to the key's head. When she pressed the key against this marking, the wall responded. Stone ground against stone with a sound like thunder, and a section of the floor began to sink, revealing steps that descended into absolute darkness. Cool air rose from the opening, carrying scents of earth and metal and something else, something that made her nose wrinkle and her instincts scream warnings. Solveig retrieved a torch from the wall bracket and lit it with flint and steel from her travel pack. The flame danced and guttered in the rising air, but provided enough light to reveal the first few steps of a stairway carved from living rock. Every rational thought told her to stop, to return to the village, to seek Magnus's counsel before proceeding. But the key in her hand pulsed warmly, and she could feel something calling to her from the depths, not the malevolent voices her grandfather had described, but something that felt like recognition, like homecoming. She descended. The stairway wound down through the mountain's heart, cut with precision that spoke of both skill and desperate purpose. The walls bore more runes, these ones darker and more angular than those in the chamber above. Her torch revealed chambers branching off the main passage storage rooms that had been carved from solid rock with painstaking care. But it was the main chamber at the stairway's end that stole her breath. The room stretched beyond her torch's reach, its ceiling supported by natural stone pillars that had been shaped and polished until they gleamed like metal. And covering every available surface stacked against walls, hanging from wooden racks, displayed on stone pedestals, were weapons. Not ordinary weapons. These were artifacts of power, each one unique, each one humming with barely contained energy, swords with blades that seemed to drink light, axes whose edges gleamed with unnatural sharpness, bows carved from wood that had never grown in any earthly forest, shields bearing symbols that hurt to look at directly. But it was the sword that drew her immediate attention, a blade displayed alone on a central altar, its steel inscribed with runes that seemed to move and shift in the torchlight. As Solveig approached, the weapon began to glow with soft blue radiance, its light pulsing in rhythm with the key in her other hand. She reached for the hilt almost without conscious thought. The moment her fingers touched the leather wrapping, the world exploded into sensation. Images flooded her mind, ancient battles fought against creatures of shadow, her ancestors standing back to back against impossible odds, warriors falling one by one as darkness advanced. She saw the weapons, being forged in fires that burned without fuel, blessed by voices that spoke in languages older than human memory. And she saw the enemy. They had been created to fight beings of malice and hunger that sought to devour not just life, but the very concept of existence. The weapons weren't tools of conquest. They were instruments of protection, safeguards against a threat so terrible that her ancestors had hidden them rather than risk their misuse. The visions ended as abruptly as they had begun, leaving Solveig gasping on her knees beside the altar. The sword's glow faded to a dim shimmer, but she could still feel its power thrumming through her bones. Above her, footsteps echoed in the circular chamber. Someone had followed her to the fortress. Solveig quickly doused her torch and pressed herself against one of the stone pillars, the rune-carved sword still gripped in her trembling hands. The footsteps above moved with purpose, circling the chamber, clearly searching. "Solveig Eriksdottir," a familiar voice called down the stairway. "I know you're down there. We need to talk." Elder Bjorn. But how had he known about the hidden chamber? How had he followed her so quickly? "Come up, child." His voice echoed strangely in the underground space. "What you've found down there, it's not meant for untrained hands. You're in more danger than you realize." The sword in her hands pulsed once, and Solveig felt a chill that had nothing to do with the underground cold. In that pulse, she sensed something wrong, not with the weapon, but with the voice calling to her. The tone was right, the words were plausible, but something underneath felt off, like a familiar song played in the wrong key. She remained silent, pressed against the pillar, and after several long minutes the footsteps above moved away. Only when she was certain she was alone did Solveig allow herself to breathe normally. Whatever was happening, whatever her family had been protecting against, it wasn't safely buried in the past. The ancient enemy lived, and somehow it knew she had found the weapons. The war her ancestors had prepared for was about to begin, and Solveig found herself standing alone at its center, holding a sword that hummed with power she didn't understand and responsibility she had never sought. The key in her other hand grew warm against her palm, and she realized with growing certainty that there was no path back to the simple life she had known. The moment she had claimed Iron Spear Fortress, she had claimed far more than land and stone. She had claimed a destiny written in starlight and sealed in blood, and the only way forward was deeper into the darkness her ancestors had died to contain. Solveig spent the night in the hidden chamber, unwilling to venture back up the stairs until she was certain her mysterious visitor had truly departed. The weapons around her seemed to pulse with gentle warmth, as if acknowledging her presence, and gradually she began to feel less like an intruder and more like someone returning home after a long absence. When dawn light finally filtered down through the opening above, she climbed the stairs cautiously, the rune-carved sword still in her grip. The circular chamber appeared exactly as she had left it, with no sign that anyone else had been there. But on the stone table where she had found the key, a new object waited, a shield unlike any she had ever seen. The War Council shield, as her mind somehow named it without conscious thought, bore the marks of countless strategic discussions. Its bronze surface was covered with scratches and marks that formed patterns, battle plans, tactical formations, the kind of visual thinking that had guided her ancestors through impossible conflicts. As she lifted it, images flashed through her mind, commanders gathered around maps, voices raised in heated debate, desperate plans forged in the face of overwhelming odds. This shield had witnessed the planning of the war her family had prepared for but never fought, and now it was hers. The morning brought practical concerns that demanded immediate attention. Solveig spent several hours exploring the fortress more thoroughly, taking inventory of what remained and what would need to be replaced. The kitchens held stores of grain and preserved meat that had somehow remained edible despite years of abandonment, another small mystery to add to the growing collection. More pressing was the question of security. The visitor from the previous night had proven that Iron Spear's isolation was no guarantee of privacy. Solveig barricaded the entrance to the hidden chamber and concealed the opening as best she could, though she suspected anyone with knowledge of the fortress's true nature would not be long deceived. By midday, she had established a basic living space in one of the smaller chambers on the second floor, close enough to the hidden arsenal for quick access, but far enough from the main entrances to provide some warning if visitors arrived. As she arranged her few possessions, her grandfather's unfinished letter kept drawing her attention. The dreams, the voices from below, young Harold seeing figures walking through walls. Solveig had experienced no dreams yet, but she had certainly heard voices both in the visions triggered by the sword and in the phantom whispers that had filled the circular chamber when she first touched the key. As for figures walking through walls, she hoped that particular phenomenon would remain in the past. Late afternoon brought the sound of horses approaching the fortress gates. Solveig peered through a window and felt relief wash over her as she recognized Magnus's massive frame astride his equally massive stallion, Grani. Behind him rode three other figures from Ravenshollow: Ingrid, Elder Ragnhild, and surprisingly, Thorstein the blacksmith. She met them in the courtyard, grateful for familiar faces after a night filled with mysteries and warnings. "You look like someone who hasn't slept," Magnus observed, his sharp eyes taking in her disheveled appearance and the way she kept glancing toward the main keep. "The fortress has more history than I expected," Solveig replied carefully. "It's been educational." Ingrid dismounted and embraced her friend warmly. "We brought supplies and news. The village has been buzzing since you left. Half the people are convinced you're destined for greatness, and the other half think you're courting disaster. What do you think?" "I think you're definitely courting something, but whether it's greatness or disaster remains to be seen." Elder Ragnhild approached with the measured steps of someone accustomed to delivering important news carefully. "There have been developments since your departure, Solveig. We felt you should know immediately." The elder's tone suggested developments of the unwelcome variety. "What kind of developments?" "Riders came to Ravenshollow yesterday evening," Ragnhild continued. "3 separate groups, all asking questions about you and the fortress. The first claimed to represent Jarl Grim of the northern settlements. They seemed surprised to learn you had already claimed Iron Spear and wanted to know if any formal challenges to your ownership remained possible. This was concerning, but not entirely unexpected. Word traveled quickly in the scattered settlements, and ambitious leaders were always alert to opportunities. The second group was more troubling," Ragnhild went on. "Strangers with southern accents, asking specifically about your family's bloodline and whether you had discovered anything unusual in the fortress. They offered significant payment for information about your activities. Solveig felt ice forming in her stomach. And the third group? Local men from the eastern valleys. They claimed they were merely curious about the new occupant of Ironspear, but their questions focused on ancient weapons and family artifacts. When pressed for details about their interest, they became evasive and departed quickly. Magnus stepped closer, his hand resting casually on his sword hilt. 3 different groups of strangers, all arriving within hours of each other, all asking about things they shouldn't know to ask about. That's not coincidence. No, Solveig agreed grimly. That's coordination. Thorstein, who had been quietly unloading supplies from the pack horses, looked up with troubled eyes. There's something else. This morning I found symbols carved into the side of my workshop, runes I didn't recognize. When I showed them to Magnus, his face went white as winter. The old warrior nodded heavily. Binding runes. Old ones, the kind used to mark territory or send messages between those who understand the old ways. What kind of messages? The kind that say, "We know where you are and what you've found." The implications settled over the group like a cold fog. Whatever Solveig had discovered in the hidden chamber, word of it was spreading through channels she didn't understand, to people she couldn't identify. "There's more," Ingrid said quietly. "Show her what you brought, Magnus." The old warrior reached into his travel pack and withdrew a leather-wrapped bundle. When he opened it, Solveig gasped. Inside lay a war axe of clearly ancient design, its steel blade inscribed with runes that seemed to shift and move in the afternoon light. "This belonged to your father," Magnus explained. "Eric asked me to keep it safe until you were old enough to understand its significance. He said when you claimed Ironspear, you would need all the protection your bloodline could provide." As Solveig reached for the axe, her fingers tingled with the same energy she had felt when touching the sword in the hidden chamber. The moment she grasped the handle, warmth spread up her arm, and she heard her father's voice as clearly as if he stood beside her. "The weapons choose their bearers, little raven. They will know if you are worthy." The axe felt perfectly balanced in her grip, its weight distributed as if it had been forged specifically for her hands. More importantly, it felt alive, aware, and responsive in a way that ordinary weapons never could. "Father knew," she said, understanding flooding through her. "He knew what was hidden here. That's why he never pressed me to claim the fortress earlier. He was waiting for me to be ready." "Ready for what?" Elder Ragnhild asked. Before Solveig could answer, Ingrid pointed toward the fortress gates. "We have company." A single rider approached up the mountain path, moving with the easy confidence of someone familiar with the route. As the figure drew closer, Solveig recognized Elder Bjorn, or at least someone who looked exactly like him. "That's impossible," Magnus muttered. "Bjorn left Ravenshollow this morning to visit his sister in the western valleys. I spoke with him myself before we departed." The rider who looked like Bjorn entered the courtyard and dismounted with fluid grace. When he turned to face them, his appearance was perfect in every detail, the same weathered features, the same grey eyes, the same silver rings in his beard. But something was fundamentally wrong. "Greetings, friends," the Bjorn thing said, its voice carrying the exact tone and inflection of the real elder. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything important." Solveig stepped forward, the War Council shield on one arm and her father's axe in the other hand. The weapons hummed with energy, responding to some threat her conscious mind hadn't yet identified. "You're not Bjorn," she said calmly. "Whatever you are, you're not welcome here." The thing wearing Bjorn's face smiled, and for just a moment its eyes reflected light like an animal's. "Clever girl. Your bloodline always was too perceptive for its own good." Around the courtyard, the air began to shimmer with heat that had nothing to do with the afternoon sun. Magnus drew his sword in one smooth motion, while Thorstein hefted his hammer and Elder Ragnhild retreated toward the horses. "What do you want?" Solveig demanded. "The same thing my kind has always wanted," the creature replied, its voice beginning to distort and multiply, as if several people were speaking in unison. To finish what was started long ago. Your ancestors were very clever, hiding the weapons, building their little prison, thinking they could contain us forever. It worked for generations, until now, until you came home and opened doors that should have remained sealed. The thing's smile widened beyond what any human face should accommodate. We should thank you, really. Without your blood to activate the old bindings, we might have waited centuries more. Horror flooded through Solveig as she understood. By claiming her inheritance, by using the key, by touching the weapons, she had somehow weakened whatever protections her ancestors had put in place. Her family's greatest victory was becoming their ultimate failure, and she was the instrument of it. But we're not unreasonable, the creature continued. Surrender the weapons willingly, and your friends can return to their village unharmed. Continue to resist, and they will learn exactly how creative our kind can be when it comes to causing suffering. The threat hung in the air like poison. Solveig looked at the faces of the people who had risked their lives to bring her aid and support, and felt the weight of decision pressing down on her shoulders. The War Council shield grew warm against her arm, and suddenly she understood why her ancestors had marked it with all those tactical discussions. Sometimes the first plan, the obvious plan, was exactly what the enemy expected. I need time to consider your offer, she said carefully. You have until sunset, the creature replied. Choose wisely, Solveig Eriksdottir. Some mistakes can never be undone. The thing wearing Bjorn's face mounted its horse and rode back down the mountain path, leaving the 5 friends standing in a courtyard that suddenly felt far too exposed and vulnerable. Well, Ingrid said into the silence that followed, that could have gone better. The sunset deadline hung over them like an executioner's axe as they gathered in the fortress's great hall. Magnus had barricaded the main entrances, while Thorstein checked the structural integrity of the walls. Ingrid tended to their horses and organized their supplies, while Elder Ragnhild studied the ancient tapestries with the focused attention of someone looking for answers in unexpected places. Solveig stood before the great hearth, her father's axe in one hand and the War Council shield strapped to her other arm. The weapons seemed to grow heavier as the light faded, their mystical energy responding to the approaching confrontation. We need to understand what we're truly facing, she said, breaking the tense silence. And I think I know where to find answers. She led them to the circular chamber on the 4th floor, where the silver-filled runes seemed to pulse with subdued light in the gathering dusk. Her companions stared in amazement at the ancient symbols, but it was the hidden entrance that truly captured their attention. How long has this been here? Elder Ragnhild asked, running her fingers along the carved stone that concealed the opening. Generations, at least. Maybe since the fortress was built. Solveig activated the mechanism with the Raven key, and once again the stone floor opened to reveal the descending stairway. Magnus lit several torches before they began their descent. If we're going into the mountain's heart, we go prepared for anything. The hidden armory impressed them all, but it was Magnus who understood most quickly what they were seeing. These aren't just weapons, he said, his voice filled with awed recognition. They're artifacts of power. Each one was forged for a specific purpose, blessed by rituals that have been forgotten for centuries. Near the back of the chamber, Solveig discovered something she had missed during her first exploration, a crystal formation that seemed to grow directly from the mountain's living rock. The memory stone, as her mind named it, was larger than her head and perfectly clear except for swirling patterns deep within its structure. What is it? Ingrid asked, approaching cautiously. I think it's a record, Solveig replied, studying the patterns within the crystal. They reminded her of the runes throughout the fortress, but these moved and shifted like living things. My ancestors found some way to preserve their knowledge. When she placed her hand on the crystal surface, the world around them vanished. Suddenly they stood in the same chamber, but it was filled with people warriors in ancient armor, their faces grim with desperate purpose. The crystal was showing them a memory from centuries past, and they could see and hear everything as if they were truly present. The binding grows stronger each day. A woman who looked remarkably like Solveig was saying. She wore the same bloodline medallion that now hung around Solveig's neck, and her voice carried the authority of absolute command. But it will not hold forever. Our children's children will need to know what we faced here. An older man, clearly her advisor, nodded gravely. The Shadowkin are patient beyond human understanding. They will wait decades, centuries if necessary, for the binding to weaken enough for their escape. Then we must ensure our descendants are prepared, the woman continued. The weapons will remain here, hidden but accessible to those with the bloodline key. The memory stone will preserve our knowledge, and the fortress itself will serve as both guardian and warning. The vision shifted, showing them scenes of the enemy the ancient warriors had faced. The Shadowkin were creatures of living darkness, beings that fed on fear and despair and grew stronger with each soul they consumed. They moved through shadows like water, struck without warning, and left nothing but emptiness in their wake. They come from the spaces between worlds, the ancient commander explained to her assembled forces. Places where light has never existed and hope is a meaningless concept. Our weapons can harm them, but only because they were forged in sacred fires and blessed by those who understand the true nature of light and darkness. The memory showed the final battle, a desperate fight in the chamber around them, as Shadowkin poured through a tear in reality itself. The ancient warriors fought with impossible courage, wielding the very weapons that now surrounded Solveig and her friends. One by one, they fell, but their sacrifice drove the creatures back long enough for the binding ritual to be completed. We seal them, not in death, but in imprisonment, the commander declared, as mystical chains of light wrapped around the retreating Shadowkin. They will hunger and rage, but they will not feed. The binding will hold as long as the bloodline endures and the weapons remain ready. As the vision faded, they found themselves back in the present, standing in the same chamber, but seeing it with new understanding. This wasn't just an armory, it was a monument to sacrifice, a prison, and a promise all combined. Now we know what the false Bjorn meant, Magnus said quietly. By activating the ancient mechanisms, you've weakened the prison that holds these creatures. They can sense freedom approaching. But why me specifically? Solveig asked. Why couldn't they escape before I arrived? Elder Ragnhild, who had been studying the crystal's surface, looked up with troubled eyes. Because the binding was tied to your bloodline, it required periodic renewal, a descendant touching the weapons, acknowledging the responsibility, accepting the burden. Your grandfather's abandonment of the fortress didn't just leave it empty, it left the magical protections without maintenance. The implications were staggering. For 15 years the prison had been slowly weakening. Solveig's arrival and activation of the ancient systems had provided exactly the mystical resonance the Shadowkin needed to begin breaking free. How long before they escape completely? Thorstein asked. Based on what we saw in the memory, Ingrid replied thoughtfully. The binding was designed to last exactly as long as it was regularly maintained. 15 years of neglect means we have very little time. As if summoned by their words, a new sound echoed through the fortress, above the sound of many feet moving in perfect unison, accompanied by voices singing in harmonies that hurt to hear. The Shadowkin weren't waiting for sunset after all. They're here, Magnus said, drawing his sword, and they've brought friends. Solveig quickly distributed weapons from the ancient armory. Magnus received a war hammer that blazed with inner fire the moment he lifted it. Thorstein claimed a massive two-handed sword that hummed with barely contained power. Ingrid selected a bow whose arrows materialized from starlight itself when she drew the string. Elder Ragnhild, despite her age, took up a staff topped with a crystal that matched the memory stone. As they prepared to ascend and face whatever awaited above, Solveig felt the weight of generations pressing down on her shoulders. Her ancestors had died to build this prison, Her grandfather had abandoned it rather than face its maintenance. Now the responsibility fell to her to either complete the cycle of sacrifice or find a new way forward. The singing above grew louder, and shadows began to move independently of any light source. The Shadowkin were no longer content to wait or negotiate. They were coming to claim what they believed was rightfully theirs, and only the ancient weapons stood between them and a freedom that would doom every living soul in the surrounding valleys. "Remember," Solveig said as they began climbing the stairs, "these weapons were forged for this purpose. Trust them, and they'll guide us through what's coming." But even as she spoke the words, doubt gnawed at her heart. The ancient warriors had been trained from birth for this battle, and they had barely managed to imprison the enemy rather than destroy them. She was a young woman with a gift for strategy, but no experience with supernatural warfare. The Memory Stone's revelations had given them knowledge, but knowledge alone might not be enough to survive what was coming. As they emerged into the circular chamber above, the sound of inhuman voices grew closer, and shadows began seeping through the walls like oil through cloth. The real battle was about to begin, and Solveig could only hope that the bloodline that had failed once before would prove strong enough to succeed where her ancestors had merely postponed the inevitable. The shadows pouring through the walls moved with predatory intelligence, pooling in the corners of the circular chamber before taking semi-solid forms. The Shadowkin weren't fully manifested yet. The binding still held enough power to limit their physical presence, but their hunger was palpable, filling the air with a cold that had nothing to do with temperature. Magnus stepped forward, his enchanted warhammer blazing with golden light that drove the nearest shadows back several feet. "They're testing our defenses, seeing how much the weapons can hurt them in their current state. How long before they become fully solid?" Solveig asked, hefting her father's axe. The ancient weapon hummed with energy, its runes glowing brighter as more shadows gathered. "Not long," Elder Ragnhild replied, her crystal-topped staff pulsing with silver radiance. "I can feel the binding weakening with each moment they press against it." In her left hand, Solveig still held the War Council shield, and as the tactical situation developed, she began to understand why this particular artifact had come to her. The bronze surface wasn't just marked with old battle plans, it was actively showing her new ones, lines of force and movement, appearing as silver traces across its surface. "There," she said, pointing to a section of wall where the shadows seemed thickest. "That's where they're concentrating their efforts. The binding is weakest there." As if responding to her words, the wall began to crack. Not physical damage, but fractures in reality itself, allowing glimpses of the dark realm where the Shadowkin had been imprisoned. Through the gaps, she could see hundreds of the creatures, their forms shifting between human shape and pure malevolence. "We need to get to higher ground," Magnus declared. "If they break through here, we'll be trapped." But as they moved toward the chamber's exit, the shadows surged forward in a coordinated assault. Solveig barely managed to block the first attack with the War Council shield, the impact sending vibrations up her arm that felt like being struck by frozen lightning. Her father's axe swept in a wide arc, its enchanted blade dispersing two of the semi-solid forms, but more kept coming. Ingrid's starlight arrows proved devastatingly effective, each one burning through the shadows like miniature suns. Thorstein's two-handed sword carved paths of brilliant destruction, while Elder Ragnhild's staff created barriers of pure light that held the creatures at bay. But they were being overwhelmed. For every shadow they destroyed, two more seemed to take its place, and the cracks in the wall were spreading rapidly. In desperation, Solveig reached for the battle horn of summoning that hung from her belt, an artifact she had claimed from the hidden armory, without fully understanding its purpose. The ancient horn was carved from what looked like ivory, but felt far more substantial, its surface covered with runes that seemed to shift and move in the light of their weapons. She raised it to her lips and blew. The sound that emerged wasn't quite music and wasn't quite noise, it was something deeper, something that resonated in the bones and called to connections that transcended physical death. The circular chamber filled with new light, and suddenly they were no longer alone. Translucent figures materialized throughout the room, ancient warriors bearing weapons that blazed with the same mystical energy as the artifacts Solveig and her friends wielded. Her ancestors had answered the horn's call, their spirits drawn from whatever realm housed the honored dead. "Granddaughter," the figure nearest to Solveig spoke, and she recognized the face from old tapestries, her great-great-grandmother, the warrior queen who had first bound the Shadowkin. "You have awakened us from our rest. The binding is failing," Solveig replied, amazed at how natural it felt to converse with the dead. "I don't know how to stop them." "The binding was never meant to be permanent," the ancient queen explained, as her spirit warriors engaged the advancing shadows. "It was a desperate measure, buying time for a solution we never found. Each generation was supposed to seek a way to destroy the Shadowkin permanently, not merely contain them. Around them, the battle between spirits and shadows raged with increasing intensity. The ancestral warriors fought with the experience of those who had faced this enemy before, but they were outnumbered and growing weaker as the binding continued to deteriorate. "Then how do we destroy them?" Magnus called out, his warhammer crushing another shadow creature. "That knowledge was lost with the death of the War Council," the Queen replied sadly. "But there were rumors, stories of weapons that could cut through the barriers between worlds, artifacts that could unmake the very essence of shadow. The World Cutter Blades, they were called, though none of our generation ever saw them." Solveig felt a chill of recognition. Where were these weapons supposed to be? Hidden deeper than we dared to delve, in chambers that predated even our settlement of this mountain. If they exist at all, they would be in the mountain's true heart, below the lowest levels we ever excavated. The implications were staggering. The armory they had discovered wasn't the fortress's greatest secret, it was merely the first layer of defenses built around something far more significant. "Grandmother," Solveig said urgently, "can you hold them here while we search for these World Cutter Blades?" The Spirit Queen's expression grew grave. "Not for long. The horn's power is limited, and we grow weaker as the binding fails. You would have perhaps an hour before the Shadowkin break through completely. An hour to find weapons that might not exist, hidden in caverns that might be unreachable, to defeat an enemy that had already conquered death itself." The War Council shield grew warm against her arm, and new tactical displays appeared on its surface, but these showed retreat routes rather than battle plans. Even her ancestors' strategic wisdom was telling her to run. "There's another problem," Elder Ragnhild said, her voice tight with effort as she maintained a barrier of light against a particularly aggressive shadow. "The village. If we fail here, these creatures won't stop with us. They'll sweep down the mountain and consume every soul in Ravenshollow." The weight of that responsibility settled on Solveig's shoulders like a mantle of lead. This wasn't just about her inheritance or her family's ancient burden anymore. Thousands of innocent lives hung in the balance, people who had shown her nothing but kindness and support. "Magnus, take the others back to the village," she decided. "Warn them to evacuate toward the eastern valleys. I'll search for the World Cutter Blades." "Absolutely not," the old warrior replied firmly. "We came here together, and we're not leaving you to face this alone. This isn't a matter for debate." "You're right," Ingrid interrupted, loosing another starlight arrow that dispersed 3 shadows at once. "It's not. We're staying, and that's final." Torstein nodded agreement, his massive sword carving through another wave of attackers. "Besides, if these deeper chambers are as dangerous as they sound, you'll need all the help you can get." Even Elder Ragnhild, despite being the least experienced fighter among them, stood firm. "Some responsibilities cannot be carried alone, child. Your ancestors learned that lesson the hard way." The Spirit Queen observed this exchange with something that might have been pride. "The bloodline remains strong, but it has grown wiser. Very well, we will hold this chamber as long as possible. Seek the World Cutter Blades in the deepest places, where the mountain's bones touch the roots of the world. And remember, courage without wisdom is merely another word for failure." As the ancestral spirits closed ranks around the growing cracks in reality, Solveig led her living companions back toward the hidden armory. If the World Cutter blades truly existed, their search would have to begin in the deepest places the original builders had excavated. The battle horn of summoning had given them allies and bought them time, but both would prove worthless if they couldn't find weapons capable of ending the threat permanently. Behind them, the sound of otherworldly combat echoed through the fortress halls, and ahead lay uncertainty that might prove even more dangerous than the enemy they already faced. The mountain held secrets within secrets, and somewhere in its deepest heart lay either salvation or the final chapter of a war that had already claimed too many lives. Solveig could only hope that when they found what they were looking for, they would prove worthy of wielding it. The hidden armory revealed new secrets under desperate scrutiny. While her companions gathered additional weapons and supplies, Solveig examined the chamber's walls with the methodical attention of someone whose life depended on finding what others had missed. It was Thorstein who made the crucial discovery. The master blacksmith's trained eye noticed inconsistencies in the stonework that would have escaped anyone else's attention. "These support pillars," he said, running his hands along the carved stone columns that held up the chamber's ceiling, "they're not just decorative. Look at the joins, they're fitted with mechanisms." Magnus joined the examination, his warrior's experience recognizing defensive architecture when he saw it. Hidden passages. Your ancestors built multiple layers of security into this place. Together, they discovered the activation sequence, specific pressure points on 3 different pillars that had to be touched simultaneously. When they managed the coordination, a section of the chamber's rear wall shifted aside with the grinding sound of stone against stone. Beyond lay a natural cavern that predated any human construction. Their torches revealed walls of living rock that had been shaped by water and time into formations that looked almost intentionally artistic. But it was the artificial additions that captured their attention. Bronze plaques set into the stone at regular intervals, each one bearing warnings in multiple ancient languages. Beyond this point lies the realm of the mountain's heart, Elder Ragnhild, translated from the nearest plaque. Only those prepared to sacrifice everything should proceed. "Encouraging," Ingrid muttered, adjusting her grip on the starlight bow. The next plaque was even less reassuring. The binding chains were forged in the deepest fires, where the mountain touches the void. They hold more than shadow, they contain the hunger that devours worlds. As they ventured deeper into the natural cavern system, the warnings became increasingly specific. The ancient builders had clearly understood exactly what they were containing, and their terror was evident in every carefully carved word. Here the guardians fell, one by one, until only chains remained, read another plaque. "The World Cutter blades lie beyond, but the price of claiming them is the soul of the one who wields them." This gave them all pause. The weapons they sought weren't just powerful, they were cursed with a cost that might make victory meaningless. "My ancestors were thorough in their warnings," Solveig observed grimly. "They wanted to make sure anyone who came this far understood exactly what they were choosing." The cavern system led steadily downward, following natural fissures in the mountain's structure that seemed to spiral toward some central point. The air grew warmer as they descended, and they began to hear sounds that had no natural explanation, distant clanking like enormous chains under stress, and beneath that, a rhythmic pulsing that felt disturbingly like a massive heartbeat. After what felt like hours of careful descent, they emerged into a chamber that defied rational explanation. The cavern was vast beyond their torches' ability to illuminate, its ceiling lost in darkness above. But the walls were lined with chains, not the iron links of ordinary restraint, but constructs of light and shadow, woven together into bonds that seemed to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously. The binding chains, Solveig realized, these were the actual mystical restraints that held the Shadowkin in their otherworldly prison, and they were clearly failing. Many of the light-forged links had dimmed to barely perceptible glimmers. Others flickered erratically, as if struggling to maintain their coherence. Along the chamber's perimeter, shadows pressed against the weakening bonds with increasing desperation, and in several places the chains had developed actual cracks. "By all the gods," Magnus breathed. "How long have these been holding?" "Centuries," Elder Ragnhild replied, her voice filled with awed horror. "And they're finally giving way." At the chamber's center stood a raised platform surrounded by the thickest concentration of chains. Whatever lay at the heart of this mystical prison was clearly the most dangerous element of all. But it was what stood beyond the platform that made Solveig's heart race with desperate hope. Two pedestals of black stone rose from the cavern floor, and upon each rested a sword unlike anything in the upper armory. The world-cutter blades were clearly artifacts of immense power. Their metal seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, and the air around them shimmered with barely contained energy. "There," she said, pointing toward the weapons. "That's what we came for." But as they approached the pedestals, new warnings became visible, runes carved directly into the cavern floor that glowed with their own internal fire. "2 blades for 2 prices," Ingrid read aloud. "The first cuts the bonds between worlds, but claims the wielder's mortality. The second severs the essence of shadow, but devours the wielder's soul. Choose wisely, for both prices must be paid." The implications were devastating. Using the world-cutter blades would save everyone else, but it would cost the lives, or worse, of whoever wielded them. "There has to be another way," Thorstein said firmly. "Your ancestors wouldn't have built a solution that required certain death." But even as he spoke, the chains around them groaned with increasing stress. Several more links flickered and went dark, and the shadows they contained pressed closer to freedom. Above, the sound of supernatural combat grew louder. The ancestral spirits were losing their battle against the emerging Shadowkin. Elder Ragnhild approached the nearest pedestal and studied the weapon resting there. "These aren't just swords," she said slowly. "They're keys. The first opens the barriers between our world and the Shadow realm, allowing the creatures to be driven back to their origin point. The second locks those barriers permanently, ensuring they can never return. And the prices? Mortality can be restored, given time and the right circumstances, but a devoured soul that's permanent destruction. Whoever uses the second blade won't just die, they'll cease to exist entirely." Solveig stared at the weapons, her mind racing through tactical possibilities. The War Council shield on her arm had gone strangely quiet, its surface showing no strategic displays. Even her ancestors' accumulated wisdom seemed to offer no guidance for this choice. "How long do we have?" Magnus asked, eyeing the deteriorating chains. "Minutes, perhaps," Ragnhild replied. "The binding is collapsing faster, now that we're this close to its anchor point." Around them, the chamber began to shake as enormous forces pressed against weakening mystical restraints. Dust fell from the ceiling, and several of the smaller chains snapped entirely, their light extinguished as their burden transferred to the remaining bonds. "I'll take the first blade," Solveig decided. "If I lose my mortality but survive, that's a price I can accept." "And I'll take the second," Magnus said grimly. "No." The voice came from behind them, and they turned to see Elder Bjorn, the real Elder Bjorn, this time emerging from the passage they had used. His face was grave but determined, and he carried weapons from the upper armory. "I followed your trail from the village when I heard what was happening." "Bjorn?" Solveig stared at him in confusion. "How did you know where to find us?" "Your grandfather told me about this place before he abandoned the fortress. Made me promise that if the binding ever failed and the bloodline returned, I would ensure the final choice was made by someone old enough to accept its consequences willingly." The elder's meaning was clear. He had come to die in their place. "I won't allow that," Solveig said firmly. "It's not your choice to make," Bjorn replied gently. "I've lived a full life, seen my children grow and prosper. You have decades ahead of you, responsibilities to fulfill. This burden was always meant for the older generation to bear." Before anyone could stop him, he stepped forward and grasped the hilt of the second world cutter blade. The moment his fingers touched the weapon, darkness began to pour from his body like smoke, but his expression remained peaceful, even as the life visibly drained from his features. "Tell my family," he said, his voice already growing faint, "that I chose my ending well." As Elder Bjorn lifted the soul-consuming blade, Solveig knew she had no choice but to claim the first weapon. The chamber shook with increasing violence, and the remaining chains were beginning to snap in rapid succession. The world cutter blades had been found, and their terrible prices were about to be paid. Whether salvation or damnation lay beyond their use, they would discover together or not at all. As Solveig reached for the first world cutter blade, Elder Bjorn's form began to fade, the soul-consuming weapon drawing his very essence into its dark metal. But in that moment of ultimate sacrifice, his eyes widened with sudden horror. "Wait," he gasped, his voice barely audible. "Something's wrong. The blade, it's not just taking my soul. It's showing me memories that aren't mine." The weapon in his hands pulsed with malevolent energy, and images began flooding from its surface, visions that made everyone in the chamber freeze with dawning terror. "The binding," Bjorn whispered, his fading voice filled with anguish. "It wasn't designed to fail naturally. Someone has been sabotaging it from within. Someone with access to the fortress's deepest secrets." Solveig's hand stopped inches from the first blade as the implications crashed over her. "What do you mean?" "The betrayer's dagger," Bjorn said, his form now translucent but his born, words gaining urgent strength from some final reservoir of will. Hidden in the weapons cache, it was used to mark the sabotage points. The same bloodline that created the binding has been systematically destroying it. Elder Ragnhild stepped forward, her crystal staff blazing with light as she examined the failing chains more carefully. "He's right. These fractures aren't from age or stress. They're from deliberate damage, inflicted over years by someone who understood exactly how the binding worked." The truth hit Solveig like a physical blow. The mysterious visitors to the village, the coordinated inquiries about her family's bloodline, the false Bjorn who had appeared at the fortress. It had all been orchestrated by someone who wanted the Shadowkin freed. "But who?" Magnus demanded, his warhammer crackling with frustrated energy. "Who would want these creatures released?" Before anyone could answer, a new voice echoed through the chamber, familiar, trusted, and now revealed as utterly false. Someone who was promised power beyond imagining in exchange for completing what my ancestor started. They turned to see another figure emerging from the passage, Elder Ragnhild. But the real Elder Ragnhild stood beside them, which meant this newcomer was something else entirely, wearing a familiar face. "Impossible," the true Ragnhild breathed. "You're me, but I'm what you could have been," the false Ragnhild replied, her voice carrying harmonics that hurt to hear. "What you were meant to be, if you had possessed the courage to claim your true inheritance." As they watched in horror, the impostor's form began to shift and change, revealing features that were recognizably human but wrong in fundamental ways. This was no Shadowkin, this was something worse. A descendant, Solveig realized with growing dread. "You're from the bloodline, but how?" "The same bloodline that bound the Shadowkin also produced those who served them," the creature explained, with obvious relish. "My ancestor was the War Council member who made the original bargain betray the binding ritual in exchange for immortality and power over Shadow. When the ritual succeeded despite his sabotage, he was cast out, but the deal remained." The betrayer's dagger materialized in the creature's hand, a weapon that radiated wrongness so profound it made the world cutter blade seem benevolent by comparison. Its blade was stained with centuries of treachery, and its very presence made the remaining chains groan with increased strain. "For generations, my bloodline has worked to weaken the binding," the false Ragnhild continued. "A mark here, a symbol there, carefully placed to accumulate damage over decades. Your grandfather sensed what was happening, but could never identify the source. He abandoned the fortress, hoping to prevent the final phase. But you needed someone from the original bloodline to complete the process, Magnus said, understanding flooding his voice. You needed Solveig to activate the ancient mechanisms and provide the mystical resonance required for the binding's collapse. Precisely. And she performed her role beautifully, opening the chambers, touching the weapons, even summoning the ancestral spirits to provide convenient distractions while I made the final preparations. Around them, the binding chains began snapping with increasing rapidity. Whatever the betrayer had done during their battle above, it was having devastating effect on the mystical prison. The World Cutter blades won't work now, the creature said with false sympathy. The sabotage has corrupted the entire system. Using them will only complete the binding's destruction and release the Shadowkin into your world permanently. Elder Bjorn, still fading but clinging to existence through sheer will, managed to speak once more. The dagger, he gasped. It's the key to everything. Destroy the dagger, break the sabotage. Impossible, the betrayer laughed. The betrayer's dagger is beyond any weapon's ability to harm. It was forged from the first betrayal itself, tempered in the despair of broken trust. No blade can cut it, no fire can melt it. But Solveig was studying the weapon with the tactical mind that had won her the fortress in the first place. The War Council shield on her arm began displaying new patterns, not battle plans, but structural analyses of mystical forces. You're wrong, she said slowly. The dagger draws its power from betrayal, which means it's vulnerable to its opposite, which is willing sacrifice, the same force that created the original binding. Before the betrayer could react, Solveig made her choice. Instead of grasping the first World Cutter blade, she threw herself forward, catching the fading Elder Bjorn and pressing her hand to the second blade alongside his. No! The betrayer screamed, raising the corrupted dagger. But it was too late. The soul-consuming blade now had two willing sacrifices, feeding its power, and the mystical mathematics of the ancient binding suddenly shifted in their favor. Instead of destroying the prison, the World Cutter blades could now repair it at the cost of both wielders' lives. Together, Solveig said to the dying elder, and felt his agreement as their combined essence poured into the weapon. The blade blazed with light that drove back the advancing shadows and sent cracks running through the betrayer's dagger. For the first time in centuries, the creature that wore Ragnhild's face showed genuine fear. This won't stop them permanently, it snarled. The Shadowkin are patient. They'll wait until another betrayer weakens the binding again. Maybe, Solveig replied, feeling her mortality beginning to drain away. But not today. And not through treachery. Around them, the binding chains began to reform, their light blazing brighter than ever before. The sabotage was being undone, the prison walls rebuilt, the ancient threat contained, and once more. But at what cost? Solveig could feel her life force flowing into the mystical working, and beside her, Elder Bjorn was fading to barely perceptible transparency. The betrayer raised the corrupted dagger for one final strike, but Magnus stepped forward with his warhammer blazing, while Ingrid drew her starlight bow. Even the true Elder Ragnhild advanced with her crystal staff, determined to protect the sacrifice being made. The plot that had taken generations to unfold was finally revealed, but its resolution would require prices that none of them had been prepared to pay. The betrayer's dagger pulsed with malevolent energy. The World Cutter blades consumed their wielders' souls, and somewhere above, the village of Ravenshollow waited in ignorant peace for a battle they would never know was being fought in their defense. The true war was just beginning, and victory would demand everything they had left to give. The chamber erupted into chaos as Magnus charged the betrayer with his blazing warhammer, while Ingrid's starlight arrows streaked through the air like falling stars. But the creature that wore Ragnhild's face moved with inhuman speed, the betrayer's dagger deflecting their attacks while sending waves of corrupting energy through the ancient stone. Solveig felt her life force continuing to drain into the second World Cutter blade, but the process was agonizingly slow. The mystical mathematics required precise timing, and rushing would only result in incomplete repair of the binding. Beside her, Elder Bjorn's spirit form had stabilized at near transparency, his sacrifice anchoring hers in the complex ritual. "The dagger is disrupting the flow," he warned, his voice barely audible over the sounds of battle. "As long as it exists, our sacrifice cannot fully take hold." Around them, the binding chains flickered between restoration and collapse, caught in mystical tension between opposing forces. Some links blazed with renewed light, while others continued to darken and crack. The prison was caught in a state of quantum uncertainty, neither fully repaired nor completely destroyed. "How long can we maintain this?" The true Elder Ragnhild called out, her crystal staff creating barriers of light that slowed but couldn't stop the betrayer's advance. "Not long enough," Solveig replied grimly. She could feel the World-Cutter blade's hunger growing stronger, demanding more of her essence with each passing moment. At this rate, she would be completely consumed before the binding could be properly restored. It was then that she noticed something that changed everything, a pair of ancient gauntlets lying forgotten near the chamber's edge. The Unity Gauntlets. Her mind named them, and suddenly she understood what her ancestors had truly intended. "Magnus," she called out, "the gauntlets by the wall, bring them here." The old warrior crushed another shadow creature with his hammer, then dove for the artifacts she indicated. The moment his hands touched them, the gauntlets blazed with golden light that complemented rather than competed with the World-Cutter blade's power. "These aren't just weapons," he said in wonder. "They're amplifiers. They're designed to share mystical burdens among multiple wielders." "Put them on," Solveig urged. "Help me carry the cost." As Magnus donned the Unity Gauntlets, Solveig felt immediate relief as the blade's soul drain was suddenly shared between them. But more importantly, she began to understand the deeper truth her ancestors had hidden in their warnings. The original binding hadn't failed because of age or sabotage alone. It had failed because it was created through individual sacrifice rather than collective effort. The War Council had tried to bear the burden alone, and that isolation had made the binding vulnerable to corruption. The betrayer was right about one thing, she realized aloud. The World-Cutter blades alone aren't enough, but they were never meant to work alone. Around the chamber, she could see other artifacts scattered by the centuries, weapons and tools that had been abandoned when the original binding was created. Each one was designed to work in harmony with the others, creating a network of mutual support rather than isolated power. "Ingrid, the bow of starlight, it's connected to the blade's energy matrix. Use it to create anchor points." "Thorstein, your sword can channel the gauntlet's amplification effect. Link it to the binding chains." "Elder Ragnhild, your staff is the focal point. It can coordinate all our efforts through the crystal network." As her friends moved to follow these intuitive instructions, Solveig felt the mystical mathematics shifting in their favor. The Unity Gauntlets were sharing the World-Cutter blade's cost among all 5 of them, making the sacrifice survivable while maintaining its power. But the betrayer sensed the change and redoubled its attacks. The corrupted dagger carved through Magnus's defenses, leaving wounds that bled shadow instead of blood. Thorstein's massive frame staggered under blows that carried the weight of centuries of accumulated treachery. "You cannot stop what has already begun," the creature snarled, its stolen features twisting into something barely recognizable as human. "The Shadowkin have waited too long to be denied now." As if summoned by these words, the chamber's shadows began to coalesce into more solid forms. The prison's partial collapse was allowing the strongest of the bound creatures to manifest physically, and their hunger was palpable in the suddenly frigid air. "Hold the formation," Solveig commanded, drawing on tactical knowledge that seemed to come from the War Council shield itself. "Don't let them separate us." But even as she spoke, she could see the impossible nature of their situation. They were trying to maintain a complex mystical ritual while fighting off supernatural enemies, and a betrayer who knew all their weaknesses. Something had to give. It was Elder Bjorn who provided the answer, his fading spirit form suddenly blazing with renewed purpose. "The horn," he said, pointing toward the battle horn of summoning that still hung from Solveig's belt. "Call them all, every ancestor who ever bore the burden. Make this a true unity." Solveig hesitated. Using the horn again would drain what remained of her life force even faster, possibly killing her before the binding could be completed. But looking around the chamber at her friends, bloodied but determined, holding their ground against impossible odds, she knew there was no choice. She raised the ancient horn to her lips and blew with every ounce of strength she possessed. The sound that emerged was deeper and more resonant than before, carrying harmonics that seemed to echo through time itself. The chamber filled with light as dozens of ancestral spirits materialized, not just the war council, but generations of her bloodline, stretching back to the first settlers of the mountain. "Granddaughter," the ancient queen spoke, her voice somehow carrying the authority of all who stood with her. "You have learned what we never understood. The binding was meant to be shared, not shouldered alone." Around them, the ghostly warriors took up positions that perfectly complemented the living defenders' efforts. Their weapons blazed with spectral fire that drove back the manifesting shadowkin, while their presence seemed to strengthen the mystical working taking place at the chamber's center. But most importantly, they began to share the Unity Gauntlet's burden. The cost of the World Cutter Blade's power was now distributed among dozens of willing souls, making it not just survivable but sustainable. The betrayer sensed this shift and made one final desperate assault. The corrupted dagger blazed with malevolent power as it carved through the ranks of spirit warriors, seeking to reach the ritual's heart before the binding could be completed. "You think unity makes you strong," it screamed, its voice now layered with the harmonics of shadow itself. "But unity also makes you vulnerable. Strike down the focal point, and all your efforts collapse." The creature's target was clear, Elder Ragnhild, whose crystal staff was coordinating the entire mystical network. If the betrayer could corrupt or destroy that connection, the partially repaired binding would shatter completely. Solveig saw the attack coming and knew that neither she nor her friends could reach Ragnhild in time. The betrayer moved with inhuman speed, the corrupted dagger aimed at the Elder's heart. But the Unity Gauntlets had taught her something crucial about shared sacrifice. She didn't need to reach Ragnhild physically. The mystical network they had created allowed for other possibilities. "All together," she called out, and felt her friend's immediate understanding. As one, they poured their combined will into the crystal staff, creating a barrier of pure intention that stood between the betrayer and its target. The corrupted dagger struck the barrier and stopped as if it had hit solid stone, its power neutralized by the collective determination of those who refused to yield. The moment of balance stretched like a held breath. On one side stood the betrayer and the manifesting shadowkin, creatures of hunger and corruption seeking to devour the world. On the other stood 5 friends and dozens of ancestral spirits, united in their determination to protect what they loved. The Unity Gauntlets blazed with golden fire, the World Cutter blade hummed with purpose, and throughout the chamber the binding chains began to sing with harmonics that spoke of restoration, redemption, and hope. The final battle was about to begin, and everything would depend on whether their unity could withstand the last, desperate assault of forces that had waited centuries for this moment of potential freedom. The barrier of collective will held for exactly 3 heartbeats before the betrayer's fury shattered it like glass. The betrayer's dagger carved through their shared determination with edges honed by centuries of accumulated treachery, and the creature's inhuman scream of rage echoed through dimensions that mortal ears were never meant to perceive. "Enough games," it snarled, its stolen features now completely twisted into something that belonged in nightmares. "If unity is your strength, then I will show you how easily unity can be corrupted." The dagger blazed with malevolent power, and suddenly the mystical network they had so carefully constructed began turning against itself. The unity gauntlets that had allowed them to share the World Cutter Blade's burden now transmitted the betrayer's corruption to every connected soul. Magnus staggered as shadow poison flowed through the gauntlets into his spirit, his warhammer's golden flame flickering as darkness seeped into its core. Thorstein's massive sword began to crack along its length, hairline fractures spreading like a disease through the enchanted metal. Even the ancestral spirits wavered, their forms becoming less solid as the corruption spread through their shared connection. The network, Elder Ragnhild gasped, her crystal staff flickering between light and shadow. It's using our own unity to destroy us from within. Solveig felt the corruption reaching for her through the World Cutter blade, seeking to turn the weapon that could repair the binding into an instrument of its final destruction. The blade's hunger for her soul suddenly felt different, not clean sacrifice, but twisted consumption that would leave nothing but emptiness behind. But in that moment of crisis, she remembered something the ancient queen had shown her in the Memory Stone's visions. The original binding hadn't been created through weapons alone. It had required something more fundamental, something the betrayer couldn't corrupt because it existed beyond the reach of treachery. "The Phoenix Blade," she whispered, and somehow her words carried to every corner of the chamber. Hidden among the lesser weapons scattered around the ancient battlefield lay the artifact that had never been used, a sword that existed not to cut or kill, but to burn away corruption and leave only truth behind. As her gaze found it, the weapon began to glow with inner fire that had nothing to do with normal flame. The Phoenix Blade was forged from something beyond metal, crystallized phoenix fire given form and purpose, waiting for someone pure enough of heart to awaken its true nature. And it called to her now with a voice like singing flame, but claiming it would mean leaving the unity gauntlets behind, breaking the connection that kept her friends alive and the partially restored binding stable. The betrayer sensed her dilemma and laughed with genuine delight. "Choose, little queen," it taunted. "Save your friends and let the binding fail, or claim the Phoenix Blade and watch them die as the network collapses." Around them, the manifesting Shadowkin pressed closer, their forms becoming more solid with each passing moment. The chamber filled with whispers in languages that predated human speech, promises of power and threats of eternal torment, blending into a cacophony that made rational thought nearly impossible. Solveig looked at her friend's Magnus, fighting to maintain his grip on weapons that were slowly turning against him. Ingrid's starlight bow dimming as shadow corruption spread through its essence, Thorstein standing firm despite the cracks spreading through his borrowed sword, Elder Ragnhild maintaining the network's focus even as it poisoned her spirit. They had followed her into the mountain's heart, trusted her judgment even when it led them towards certain death, chosen to stand with her against forces beyond mortal comprehension. The thought of abandoning them was unthinkable. But the Phoenix Blade's call grew, stronger, and with it came understanding that changed everything. "Unity doesn't require connection," she said aloud, the realization flooding through her like dawn breaking over winter mountains. "It requires choice." Before the betrayer could react, Solveig made her decision. Instead of abandoning the unity gauntlets, she called out to her friends with absolute trust in their judgment. "Break the network. Choose your own path to victory." Magnus was the first to understand. With a roar of defiant laughter, he tore off the unity gauntlets and hurled them aside, his warhammer blazing with renewed golden fire as the corruption lost its hold on him. "Better to fight alone than to fight corrupted," he declared, charging the nearest group of Shadowkin with devastating effectiveness. Ingrid followed immediately, severing her connection to the failing network and focusing her starlight bow on creating barriers of pure light between the manifesting enemies and the ritual's heart. "Some bonds are stronger than mystical connections," she called out, her arrows burning through shadow creatures with renewed intensity. Thorstein discarded his cracking sword and claimed a massive two-handed axe from the scattered weapons, its blade igniting with elemental fire the moment he lifted it. "I choose to stand with friends," he announced, positioning himself to guard Elder Ragnhild's flank. Even the ancestral spirits seemed to understand, breaking their mystical formation to fight as individuals united by purpose rather than magical compulsion. Their weapons blazed brighter as they reclaimed their autonomy, and their battle cries echoed with the joy of souls choosing their fate rather than having it imposed upon them. But it was Elder Ragnhild who made the most crucial choice. Instead of maintaining the failing network, she turned her crystal staff toward the phoenix blade and spoke words in the old tongue that made the ancient weapon blaze like a star. "The network was routine, always meant to fail," she said, understanding flooding her voice. "It was a test. True unity comes from individual choice, not mystical compulsion." As her friends reclaimed their autonomy and fought with renewed determination, Solveig finally reached for the phoenix blade. The moment her fingers touched its crystalline hilt, fire that burned without destroying poured through her veins, cleansing away the World-Cutter blade's corruption and revealing the weapon's true purpose. It wasn't meant to consume souls, it was meant to forge them. The sacrifice it required wasn't death, but transformation into something greater than what came before. The betrayer sensed this shift and made one last desperate attack, the corrupted dagger seeking Solveig's heart before she could complete her transformation. But the phoenix blade rose to meet it, and when the two weapons clashed, the sound was like the birth of stars. Fire met corruption in a contest that shook the mountain's foundations. Around them, the chamber began to change as the phoenix blade's influence spread, burning away centuries of accumulated shadow and revealing the pristine stone beneath. The betrayer's stolen form began to smoke and crack as the purifying flame touched it, and for the first time in their long existence, the creature that had orchestrated generations of treachery showed genuine fear. "This isn't possible," it gasped, its voice fracturing into multiple harmonics as its nature was revealed. The phoenix blade was lost, destroyed in the first binding. "No," Solveig replied, feeling the weapon's true history flowing through her transformed awareness. "It was hidden, waiting for someone who understood that the greatest victory comes not from defeating your enemies, but from transforming them." As the phoenix blade's fire spread through the chamber, even the manifesting shadowkin began to change. The purifying flame didn't destroy them, it revealed what they had been before corruption. It claimed them, showing glimpses of the souls that had been twisted into creatures of hunger and despair. The final phase of the battle was about to begin, but now it would be fought not with weapons of destruction, but with the transformative power of a blade that could burn away lies and leave only truth behind. The phoenix blade's transformative fire spread through the chamber like dawn breaking over a world that had known only night. Where its light touched the manifesting shadowkin, their forms began to shift and change, revealing glimpses of what they had been before. Corruption claimed them warriors, scholars, children, all twisted by hunger they had never chosen. But transformation came with a price that Solveig was only beginning to understand. The phoenix blade didn't just purify it, demanded absolute commitment from its wielder. To save the corrupted souls around her, she would have to surrender her own mortal nature permanently, becoming something between human and divine that could channel the purifying flame for eternity. In the chamber's heart, a new artifact began to manifest, the heart of the fortress itself, a crystalline core that pulsed with the mountain's own life force. As the phoenix blade's fire reached it, the heart blazed with light that revealed the truth about Ironspear's purpose. The fortress had never been just a stronghold or a prison. It was a beacon, designed to hold back the darkness not through violence, but through the transformative power of willing sacrifice channeled into perpetual protection. "You see it now," the betrayer gasped, its corrupted form beginning to smoke and crack under the phoenix blade's influence. "The true cost of victory." To save them all, you must become the guardian eternal, never to know mortal love or simple human joy again. Solveig felt the weight of that choice, pressing down on her like the mountain itself. Around her, her friends fought with desperate courage, but she could see the toll the battle was taking. Magnus's warhammer blazed with diminishing light as his strength began to fail. Ingrid's starlight arrows came slower, each one requiring more of her life force. Thorstein bled from dozens of shadow wounds that wouldn't heal, while Elder Ragnhild's crystal staff flickered with unstable energy. They were dying to give her time to make the ultimate choice, and she knew that choice with crystalline clarity. "Some prices are worth paying," she said, raising the phoenix blade toward the heart of the fortress. But before she could complete the transformation, Elder Bjorn's spirit form blazed with sudden intensity. "Wait," he called out, his voice carrying new authority. "Look around you, child. Really look." Following his guidance, Solveig saw what she had missed in the battle's chaos. Her friends weren't just fighting, they were changing. Magnus's warhammer had evolved into something beyond its original form, channeling not just golden fire, but the very essence of protective determination. Ingrid's bow now created arrows of pure hope that transformed shadow creatures back into their original forms. Thorstein's axe burned with the flame of absolute loyalty, while Elder Ragnhild's staff had become a conduit for collective wisdom. "The phoenix blade doesn't require one eternal guardian," Bjorn explained, his spirit form growing more solid rather than less. "It creates them. Each of you who chooses to stand against the darkness becomes part of the eternal watch." Understanding flooded through Solveig like revelation. The choice wasn't between her humanity and everyone else's salvation, it was between isolation and true unity. The Phoenix Blade offered not lone guardianship, but shared responsibility among all who were willing to sacrifice for something greater than themselves. "Together," she said, and felt her friend's immediate understanding. As one, they focused their transformed weapons on the heart of the fortress. The mountain's core blazed with light that drove back every shadow in the chamber, revealing the betrayer's true form, not a corrupted descendant, but something far older and more fundamental. It was betrayal itself given form, the living embodiment of every broken trust and abandoned loyalty since the world began. "You cannot transform me," it snarled, raising the corrupted dagger in defiance. "I am betrayal eternal. I existed before your species learned to speak, and I will endure long after your sun grows cold." "Maybe," Solveig replied, feeling the phoenix blade's wisdom flowing through her. "But you won't endure here." The final moment stretched like eternity as two fundamental forces met in conflict: transformation against corruption, unity against betrayal, hope against despair. The phoenix blade blazed with fire that seemed to burn in colors that had no names, while the betrayer's dagger pulsed with darkness that absorbed light itself. But in that moment of ultimate confrontation, Solveig realized the deepest truth her ancestors had discovered. Victory didn't come from destroying the enemy, it came from choosing not to become them. Instead of striking with the phoenix blade, she lowered it and spoke words that changed everything. "I forgive you." The betrayer's form froze, its eternal rage suddenly confronted with something it had never encountered in eons of existence. Mercy offered freely to that which deserved none. "Impossible," it whispered, the corrupted dagger trembling in its grip. "All betrayal begins with pain," Solveig continued, the phoenix blade's wisdom showing her glimpses of the creature's origins, a soul so wounded by ancient treachery that it had become treachery itself. "And all pain can be healed, given time and the right touch." The phoenix blade's fire reached out not to burn, but to heal, offering transformation even to that which had defined itself through corruption. The chamber filled with light that was somehow gentle despite its incredible power, and for the first time in millennia, the embodiment of betrayal faced a choice. It could accept transformation and find peace, or it could cling to its nature and face the consequences of absolute isolation. Around them, the heart of the fortress pulsed with patient expectation, ready to accommodate whatever choice was made. The betrayer's dagger began to crack, not from external force, but from internal conflict, as its wielder confronted the possibility of redemption after eons of self-defined damnation. The choice hung in the balance, and with it, the fate of not just the mountain or the village below, but the very nature of how darkness and light would interact in the world to come. The moment stretched like eternity, as the embodiment of betrayal faced a choice no one had expected it would ever need to make. Around them, the heart of the fortress pulsed with patient light, while the phoenix blade's transformative fire offered healing to wounds that had festered since the dawn of consciousness. Slowly, trembling like a leaf in winter wind, the creature that had defined itself through millennia of treachery lowered the corrupted dagger. It began, then stopped, as if the concept of choosing redemption was too foreign for words that had only ever known malice. The betrayer's dagger cracked completely, its accumulated darkness flowing away like water finding the sea. As the weapon crumbled to dust, the creature's stolen form began to change, revealing not the monster it had become, but the wounded soul it had originally been, ancient beyond measure, scarred by betrayals so fundamental they had shaped the very nature of treachery itself. "I choose," it whispered, and the words carried the weight of cosmic decision. "I choose to stop." The phoenix blade's fire embraced the ancient spirit gently, not burning away its essence, but transforming its pain into something that could finally heal. The creature dissolved into motes of light that spiraled upward through the mountain stone, carrying with them the accumulated suffering of eons, finally finding rest. With the source of corruption removed, the chamber began to change. The binding chains, no longer fighting against sabotage, settled into their proper function not as prison bars, but as protective barriers that would keep the spaces between worlds stable. The Shadowkin, freed from the hunger that had driven them, began their own transformation back toward whatever they had been before their fall. At the chamber's heart, the heart of the fortress pulsed with new purpose. As Solveig approached, her friends at her side, she understood what came next. The mountain's core wasn't just a power source, it was an offering, waiting for guardians who would choose protection over conquest. "The guardian's crown," she said, recognizing the simple circlet of silver that materialized above the heart. It wasn't ornate or jeweled, but it radiated the quiet authority of absolute commitment to something greater than personal gain. "Are you ready?" Magnus asked, his warhammer now blazing with steady light that spoke of eternal vigilance willingly chosen. Solveig looked at her friends, truly looked at them, seeing how the battle had changed them all. They bore the marks of transformation, carrying within them the same eternal fire that burned in the phoenix blade. They had each made the choice to become something more than mortal, accepting responsibility for protecting not just the mountain, but the balance between light and darkness itself. "We're ready," she replied, speaking for all of them. As she placed the guardian's crown upon her head, Solveig felt the weight of centuries settling on her shoulders, but it was a burden shared among true companions, making it not a crushing responsibility, but a privilege earned through sacrifice and choice. The fortress above them began to sing, its stones resonating with harmonies that spoke of protection, wisdom, and hope. The darkness that had haunted its halls for 15 years lifted like morning mist, replaced by the warm light of purpose fulfilled. 3 days later, riders from Ravenshollow found the mountain transformed. Where once stood an abandoned fortress of questionable reputation, now rose a beacon of light, visible from dozens of miles away. The structure itself remained unchanged, but its purpose had been clarified for all to see. Solveig met them in the courtyard, wearing the simple robes of a guardian rather than the finery of a conqueror. The crown upon her head was barely visible, more felt than seen, but its presence commanded respect from all who approached. "The binding is restored," she told the village delegation, which included Ingrid's parents and several members of the council. "The threat has been contained, transformed, and resolved. But more than that, Iron Spear now serves as a true guardian for all the settlements in these valleys. She didn't mention the price paid or the transformations undergone. Some knowledge was too heavy for those who hadn't chosen to bear it. Instead, she spoke of the future. The fortress would serve as a school for those who wished to learn the deeper mysteries of protection and service. It would be a place where the old wisdom could be preserved and the ancient weapons studied safely. Most importantly, it would stand as proof that some battles could be won not through violence, but through the courage to choose forgiveness over vengeance. As the delegation prepared to return to Ravenshollow with news of the mountain's transformation, Solveig stood once more at the edge of her world, watching the sun paint the fjord gold. But now her world was larger, her responsibility deeper, and her understanding clearer. She was no longer the young woman who had claimed an inheritance 3 days ago. She was a guardian eternal, keeper of ancient peace, protector of the balance that allowed light and darkness to coexist without one consuming the other. Magnus joined her at the wall, his own transformation visible in the steady light that now surrounded him like a gentle aura. Any regrets? Solveig considered the question seriously. She had given up the possibility of a simple life, of marriage and children, and the quiet contentment of ordinary mortality. But in exchange, she had gained something immeasurable, the knowledge that her choices had broken a cycle of violence that had persisted for millennia. "None," she said finally. "Some gifts are worth any price." Behind them, Ingrid's laughter echoed from the fortress halls as she discovered yet another wonder hidden in the ancient stones. Thorstein's hammer rang against his forge, crafting new tools for the work ahead. Elder Ragnhild transcribed the memory crystal's contents, preserving wisdom for future generations. They had found their place in a story larger than any of them had imagined, and in doing so, had ensured that the story itself could continue. The mountains stood guard, the valleys lay peaceful, and in the world beyond, darkness and light continued their eternal dance, balanced now by guardians who had learned that the greatest victory came not from defeating your enemies, but from helping them remember who they had been before they became your enemies. The guardian's crown caught the last light of day, and Solveig smiled as she felt the mountain's contentment flowing through the stones beneath her feet. The fortress had found its purpose at last, and with it, she had found hers. The inheritance was complete, the bloodline's duty fulfilled, and the future stretched ahead bright with possibility.